In this time of rapid change in our community, as buildings disappear in a single day and whole streetscapes lose their comforting familiarity, it's more important than ever that we make informed decisions with regard to the fate of our built heritage. For this reason, your ACO, North Waterloo chapter, has been dedicating its lecture series this year to examining best practices in renovation and restoration projects, past and present. The first lecture in the series was delivered last November by Dr. Robert Shipley, who introduced us to the wisdom gained by leaders of the first restoration movement in Britain and the continent, beginning in the mid-19th century. The second two lectures were designed to share insights brought to the table by Professor Rick Haldenby of the School of Architecture. Rick brings a unique perspective to heritage preservation, having committed much time and energy to public education, specifically to the importance of excellent architectural design and its influence on public life. In his first lecture, presented February the 12th, Rick shared examples of so-called heritage preservation executed in response to contemporary urban forms and pressures. Tonight's lecture, Boomtown Waterloo Region, is brought to you virtually thanks to the generosity and technical know-how of the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. In this time of rapid growth and climate change, pressures in cities across Canada are intense, are threatening heritage buildings and landscapes like never before. In this lecture, Professor Haldenby will consider these broader issues facing Canadian cities and Waterloo Region in particular. Take it away, Rick.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. I will actually go back and very briefly recap that first lecture, which seems now a lifetime ago, because of what we've been through the last 8 or 9 months. This event is jointly sponsored by the University of Waterloo School of Architecture and the ACO North Waterloo branch. And so it is our habit at school to begin every event with an acknowledgement. And so I shall do that. I respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. The appropriateness of this acknowledgement will become obvious as we get towards the end of this talk. So I'm now going to share my screen, and hopefully this works for everybody. At what cost preservation? When I gave the first talk back in February, I was looking at individual buildings and individual instances in which I posed the question, was this the appropriate way to approach heritage preservation? And I showed some examples. What I consider to be a pretty abhorrent approach to preservation, and pose the question, in these cases, this happens to be one in Toronto, this happens to be one in Waterloo, and this happens to be a proposal in Fort Kitchener, that if a project in actually preserving a building does it only in dignity, what sense is there in such a situation? It was a question that I considered at the time to be attached primarily, of course, to individual building projects. But from these 3 examples and the many other ones that I showed in February, it's clear that we have a problem here, that for some reason authorities are in their zeal to preserve the actual fact of an historic structure, or at least an old structure, are producing a kind of perverse result where the structure is not only not enhanced in the preservation, but it is actually degraded, made superficial, decontextualized, and literally disembodied and transfixed. This is not a good thing. Now, for the second talk, as Susan said, I want to go into some bigger questions. And as you may intuit, I did have rather extensive notes to go along with these slides, but I should have printed them before. I thought I could watch them on second screen, but that's not what happens. So it's fine this way. I'll go through as I usually do, using the images as my notes. I'm going to focus on some general issues in architectural heritage and urban heritage this evening. I am going to focus on the situation in Waterloo region, and because of the research that I've been doing with my assistants recently, that focus does fall on downtown Kitchener in particular. Downtown Kitchener is not the only urban core in Waterloo region that's booming. Waterloo is experiencing rapid and very transformative growth. Not so much in the immediate core, but in the area around the core. Kitchener, for its part, as you can see from this shot, this is taken from just beside the railway tracks at Park Street. Extraordinary amount of construction that's going on, and construction that is at a completely different scale than any that has gone on previously. Here we can see 5 cranes in just one, 6 cranes in just one photograph. It is a building boom, the likes of which we have never seen before, and which may never have been seen before in southwestern Ontario. There is an appetite for the construction, not only of new residential buildings, but also commercial buildings, again, that has not been seen before. It would seem in this sense axiomatic, given the amount of new construction that's going on, that there is a threat to traditional building form and to the urban fabric of downtown Kitchener and the other urban centers in Waterloo region. But there are also other forces in the field. And so I want to look at the problem of the boom town, the problem that this amount of construction and this amount of transformation is going to bring to our city. But I also want to consider it in light, and I want to consider that in relation to what we as architects, students of architecture, and people who are interested in heritage and heritage preservation, what are the implications of all this for us? And then I could not help but, in the present day, given the events of the last months and years, ask myself the question, what does any of this have to do with the crisis that we are experiencing in the world today? Crises that involve our health, crises that involve social and racial equity and justice, and crises that are clearly related to climate change and its implications. Now, that might seem to be a lot, and it is. I will try to bring it down to a couple of issues that are immediate and accessible, but I hope I hope this is not too disjointed. I'm going to talk a bit about the boom in our region, and particularly in the city where I actually live. Some of you have heard me do this before, have heard me speak of this before, and so I apologize to those of you who have seen a couple of these slides. But I think for the larger audience, those of you who have not heard me talk about this, it will be informative to look at this situation. First of all, let's talk about the background. Number one, the census district of Kitchener, as it's called, has risen to be the 10th largest in Canada. The Kitchener Census District entered the top 10 in the country over the last decade and is likely to move up. We are the fastest growing metropolitan area in Canada. That in some way accounts for the boom, but not entirely. We are the 8th in order and the smallest municipality in Canada with a rail-based public transit system. The ION came into existence with a certain amount of pain, thanks to our friends at Bombardier, but it is working, and it has clearly had an agency in provoking a massive amount of urban development all across the region. And it represents, of course, a kind of generational change. Since the 1960s, when the 401 and the Conestoga Parkway were built, and when the system of arterial roads that crosses our region was laid out, we have been a singularly automotive city, a city dominated by cars. Public transit grew. Our regional transit system became a very large system over the last 20 years, but the advent of light rail changes the game. And it has clearly changed the game in terms of urban development and threats to the urban heritage of our region. We do have, as a region, and an absolutely clear tradition of technical, industrial, economic, and other forms of innovation. Our industries have been strong. We were founded on industry, and our industries have continued to drive the economy. We have, in the post-war period, outpaced virtually every other municipality in Canada in terms of the enrichment and expansion and enrichment of our educational infrastructure. The region bought into the principle of intensification that was elaborated by the provincial government as a response to urban sprawl, climate change, and other environmental concerns. And there is no doubt that the boom is an expression of that adoption of and acceptance of the principle of urban intensification. That said, of course, our region, like many others in the country, many other metropolitan areas in the country, is suffering from massive challenges in affordability of housing. And so at the same time, we are seeing a huge amount of construction, both residential and commercial. We are not solving the problem of affordability, and we need to look at affordability and as advocates for architectural heritage and architectural preservation, we have to accept some challenges to some of our sacred beliefs in respect of questions of affordability. And those of you who have, for example, been following Mr. Boskovich in the Globe and Mail, he is one who is currently advocating for relaxation of some of the heritage restrictions. Well, this is an image that tries to sort of sum up a lot of the issues here. Number one, light rail transit. Number two, innovation. And number three, the fact that that innovation is built on a foundation, both literal and figurative, of industry. The ION and its future extension, the present ION and its future extension down to Cambridge, runs from southeast to northwest and links the region on a diagonal. It has some curious route decisions, but as it moves through the centers of Kitchener and Waterloo, it's pretty straightforward. It moves up the central axis of the two urban areas and has brought about substantial and transformative change. And this picture of the intersection of Gaukel and Charles again tries to sum it up. We see the ION, we see the base of a tower, a condominium tower that's going to reach, is close now to 31 stories. It's actually getting there. I never thought I'd see the day. And of course, in the background, the ghost of a previous effort at urban revitalization, the remains of the King Center, which has been sadly abandoned once again by yet another owner and left, hopefully to be saved by at least someone. Well, the profile is changing. The 18-story tower at the corner of King and Victoria is going to be dwarfed by the 31 stories of Charlie West and the 41 stories of DTK. I mean, there's simply no getting around the fact that the profile of the city is changing. It will never be the same. And if it were only these two towers, that would be dramatic. But of course, it's not. And it's worth dissecting for a moment the scale and nature of this transformation, of this building boom. We've been tracking this, and it is, I was fascinated by going back to 1992, the opening of Kitchener City Hall, because of course, the advocates for Kitchener City Hall, including me, said that the city's investment in that building, which of course is an international award-winning building, would pay off in terms of urban revitalization. Well, the payoff wasn't exactly immediate. The critical response was good, and the building is good. Over the 25 years from the opening of Kitchener City Hall to 2017, there were 24 major projects in downtown Kitchener, i.e. just under, a tiny bit under one a year. In the end of 2017, I returned to Kitchener after having been out of the country, as I normally am in the fall. In December 2017, and Terry Pender from The Record called me and said, did you know that the city was going to see $1.2 billion in building permits issued for construction that should begin immediately, because of course the provocation for this was that the city was going to abandon the practice of forgiving developers development charges for projects in the urban core. It was going to re-implement development charges in the urban core. So developers came in huge numbers and with big projects and wanted to get them in the ground, which they did. The result is that there were, in a period of less than 2 years, the same number of projects that we'd seen in the previous 25. It's just a staggering transformation. And in a certain way, a threat, because whatever the core was in 2017, it's not going to be that when this generation of projects is completed. Well, I had a research assistant simply do a 3-dimensional drawing of the 24 projects from 1992 to 2017. And you can see them here. Some of them are renovations, the tannery, of course. I mean, city starts with City Hall. You have the renovation of the original county courthouse on Weber Street. You have the new courthouse. You have the Kitchener Market. It's a variety of projects at some of them quite large. I mean, the courthouse, the new courthouse, is a huge building. A fair mix, and pretty widely distributed. This is an image at the same scale of the 24 projects that are on the go today. And they also are widely distributed. They are much higher overall, and they dramatically affect the landscape. This is the two combined. The drawing combines, shows both at the same time. And clearly, the present generation of buildings overwhelms the previous generation. But let's just look at these simple numbers. So between 1992 and 2017, of the 24 projects, 12 were new buildings, 11 were renos, 1 was a combination reno with major additions, 11 were publicly funded, 11 were privately funded, and 2 were public-private partnerships. 3 were civic, 3 institutional, 3 educational, 3 commercial, 8 residential, 1 was a parking lot, and 1 was a hotel. Today, 22 projects are new, 1 is a reno, and 1 is a combination. 1 is public, 23 are private, 1 is institutional, 1 is commercial, 19 are residential. It's not clear exactly how many new residents this is going to bring into downtown Kitchener, but it is certainly well north of 5,000. It is going to change the population of downtown Kitchener dramatically. It's going to make it, in effect, a residential area again. The commercial projects are ambitious. Of course, the expansion of the Google enterprise, several important commercial buildings are going up, but the dominant funding is private. The dominant use is residential. This is a map from the recent report on urban intensification produced by the region of Waterloo. And in it, you have the mapping of all of the high density projects across the whole region. And without going into any great detail on it, it becomes pretty self-evident that the vast majority of those projects are located in built-up urban areas very close to the new light rail transit system. It's pretty clear that this piece of infrastructure has created a kind of magnetic effect, which is drawing development to it. And the number of projects is simply staggering. In the intensification report, the region also reports that for the first time, virtually half of the projects are high density projects. And the other half are split between single family and lower and medium density projects. That is, in terms of the total number of units that are being produced. That is a huge transformation in our region, from single family homes to high density residential. Well, these are some of the commercial buildings that are appearing right now. Some are almost finished, some are under construction, some are to start. The residential buildings, Charlie West at the top left, DTK on the right, and the cluster of residential and commercial buildings going up on Victoria Street. The commercial building is perched on top of the old Huck Glove plant, and there are 3 condo towers. One is already constructed, and the other 2 are under construction. The huge project. This is the project that's being built between Cortlandt Avenue and the Arrow Lofts. I don't really know what to say about it. It is not an elegant building, but it has a huge number of units in it. And then, of course, the project just north of the railway tracks on King Street around the Kaufman Mansion that proposes 5 condominium towers clustered around an open area, and in the center of the open area, the mansion is allowed to survive and actually exist in a kind of reasonable degree of integrity. But the scale of this thing is just truly a revelation. This is Mill Street, the site of another intensification project, which, whereas most of these, of the ones that have gone, that I've shown you up to now, went up in areas that were either industrial areas or parking lots or commercial spaces. The new building on Mill Street is going to demolish existing houses, and in a situation where the existing residential typology was absolutely consistent and intact. And instead, as you can see, the first 2 houses are surviving, and then behind it, this thing is appearing. And then there's a row of townhouses that face onto Mill Street that attempt to modify the scale or mediate the scale between the tower at the back, the slab at the back, and the scale of the street and the scale of houses that face on it. I'm not going to, you know, these are questions of architectural judgment, but it is clear, it seems to me clear that with this project, we are seeing a situation that there will be interventions in existing residential neighborhoods, and they are going to lead to the destruction of a fair amount of the historic fabric of the city. When Ken Greenberg came to speak in 2019 at the speaker series that was organized by the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery, he said, change is happening at a breakneck pace in the region could lead to marvelous new spaces and vistas in the cities, or it could lead to soulless urban wastelands of towering condos jammed together with few public spaces that invite people to pause and linger. It seems to me that it's pretty clear that we have to be extremely careful. We do have to protect significant buildings. We have not been great at it in Waterloo region. Yet we want to create a multi-layered and multi-dimensional city. We don't, it's not a museum. A city is a city, and it has to have the forms of contemporary life in it, and they have to be housed in an appropriate way. And in order to do that, we don't want to just protect significant buildings, we want to create significant buildings. I mean, we've had a really substantial tradition of building some excellent buildings here. I've pointed out on other occasions, and some of you have heard me, that the highest award for architectural design in Canada is the Governor General's Medal. Kitchener-Waterloo has more Governor General's medals than any other cities in Canada other than Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. That is a kind of remarkable fact, and reflects the fact that there is excellence in design that resides in our community. And I would argue, of course, that it's a tradition that leads back through the post-war modern period, when we had really quite a strong culture of local design. We had 7 local architectural firms that were producing really high quality buildings. And of course, that I would trace that then back further into the past, into the tradition of industrial buildings, and particularly, of course, the industrial buildings built by the great Albert Kahn. Well, we should create significant buildings. We should protect the ones we have, and we should create new significant buildings. But it seems to me most important that we have to compensate for the reduction of the size and quality of private space. I mean, if half the residential units in the region are high density residential, which almost certainly means very small in the current practices of residential design, these condos are small. So a lot of people are going to be living in much smaller spaces than they would have been had they been born 50 years earlier. And of course, there will be no or very little private outdoor space associated with these buildings. This is clear. But what is also clear is that all of these buildings will bring a substantial increase in the tax base and tax revenues that our municipalities will enjoy. And therefore, it seems to me that both for basic issues of civility, humanity, and based on the necessity of creating an urban environment that is livable and attractive to people and I don't want to fall into a kind of neoliberal competition for the most talented people in the world, but we actually have to build livable cities. And as Ken Greenberg said, if we don't do it carefully, we're going to create a disaster. So we do have to take care of our public spaces. We do have to create new public spaces. We do need to provide cultural and recreational resources for the thousands of people who will be living in downtowns across Waterloo region, not just Kitchener. Not just Kitchener. Well, we have some good signs. I mean, I think Ernest's fountain in Victoria Park is a fantastic piece of public art. I'm not so sure about this one, painting the street. I'm not sure how that actually contributes to the quality of public space, but it's a project. It's something. It's a kind of ornamentation of the public space. And of course, I will say the city of Kitchener did invest a tremendous amount of money in improving the streetscape of King Street, and has done a pretty darn good job of it. They are now looking at Queen Street. Well, they're more than looking at it. These projects are almost finished. The little green area at Duke and Queen is finished. If you go down there now, it's actually quite beautiful. But I mean, we need to do more, and we need to be more imaginative. We need to be more creative. We need to be more engaging. We need to engage our public space with culture and program and opportunities. And we have a great festival culture in Waterloo Region. I absolutely agree with that. And it is part of our culture here. It is part of our heritage here. But to make sure that we have the space, I mean, we have Victoria Park, we have City Hall Square, we have spaces but they could be, even more imaginative and ambitious in engaging modern technology, modern art and culture. I mean, I think the extraordinary effort in Toronto, the Greenway under the Gardiner Expressway, fantastic idea, fantastic design, turns the Gardiner into a kind of colonnade, a portico for the Fort York Interpretive Center, a colonnade, a sheltered park. Extraordinary idea. We need some of those. The second topic I want to address is the infamous yellow zone, because this is the basis of I would say a highly conflicted situation, the yellow zone in the missing middle, we'll call it. The yellow zone, and here's a zoning map of Kitchener, and the yellow zone in zoning plans is single family low-rise residential building. And many of the critics of the present zoning regulations point to the fact that in virtually every zoning map in North America, the vast majority of the land is zoned low-rise residential. It's interesting when I do research on the post-war period in Waterloo Region, you look at the aerial photographs and you look at the plans and you see that the ratio between industrial and commercial architecture and residential architecture is very different. There's much less residential architecture. One has to understand that in those periods, the housing, much of which survives to today, was much more densely inhabited than it is today. And this is a well-documented fact, of course, that when we talk about low-rise residential, because of the change in the nature of the demographics, because of the change in the size of families and the nature of families, these areas were always pretty low density, but now they're even lower density than they have historically been. It's a pretty conventionally understood fact that there are literally hundreds of thousands of empty bedrooms in homes like mine, where my wife and I happily occupy a big house in Victoria Park and have plenty of spare rooms. If all of the baby boomers like us moved out of our houses and turned them over, we could solve the housing crisis pretty much overnight. But the problem with this, and it's very well documented, this whole issue is documented in a book that came out just a few months ago called House Divided. It deals with the situation in Toronto, but it's Alex, Cheryl, John, and Annabelle Vaughn and they've compiled a whole set of essays that analyze the housing situation in Toronto and basically propose that what they call the missing middle could solve the affordability crisis. I think they're a bit optimistic about that, but there's some extremely interesting essays that look at the present housing crisis from a fresh point of view. In his essay, John Loring talks about the situation that transpired in Toronto in the 1960s, where up to the 1960s, it was not easy, but it was possible for developers to build multiple residential units in existing low-rise residential areas. And so he goes so far as to point out that in South Rosedale, one of the most aristocratic residential districts in Toronto, people have been able to build 19 apartment buildings up until the mid-1960s. Not all of them were easy to do, but they had done it. And the scale was small. They couldn't be more than 3 stories technically on the street. Sometimes because of the ravines, they were deeper at the back than the front, and sometimes they exceeded 3 stories. But there was a commensurate scale to them. They increased the density considerably, and they created mixed incomes and mixed demographics in areas of Toronto, traditional areas of Toronto. And this was true even here. I mean, I live on David Street. In David Street, there were apartment buildings built in the 1950s at the end of the street. They're incorporated into the fabric of the neighborhood, and they are not really aliens in our part of the world. What happened in 1965 in Toronto was pretty dramatic, and it reflected a change that went on all over North America. And that is to say that in 1965, a new plan for Toronto was promulgated, and it divided residential districts into 3 types. The first type was areas of intervention. And those were areas in which the government was going to intervene to modify an area. Normally they were dealing with areas that had been characterized as slums, this becomes very controversial. It was controversial at the time, it's even more controversial now. And it involved public finance, creating public housing. The second district was called stable residential districts, and the text of the new plan in Toronto used the word inviolate. They were protected. They were not to be touched, not to be changed. And then another set of areas were set aside for private development. Well, and of course, this at the same time that expressways were being built, shopping malls were being built, the cities were undergoing a complete transformation. But in a world of complete transformation, one area, one type of area was set aside as inviolate, and that type of area represented the majority of the land in Toronto, as it did in Kitchener and other cities. There has been an awful lot change in cities in North America between 1965 and today. But the yellow zone is still the yellow zone. It may have been eaten away at the edges. There may have been some modifications to it, but actually not very many. And the problem, of course, here is that the majority of the areas that were designated yellow were, of course, the ones that were associated with people of higher income. And it would be naive to think that there were no political parameters operating in these situations. It, of course, is characteristic of our time, especially in the wake of the events of the last 8 months, to look for inequities, racial, cultural, economic inequities. And the simple truth is you will find them if you examine the phenomena about which I'm speaking right now. So this is a map of income distribution in Toronto. And as you can see, the yellow zone and the dark blue is highest income bracket, down to the yellow, which is the lowest. And as you can see, you basically have a situation where the center axis of Toronto, the traditional built up area of the city, the yellow zones are the highest income. And then you have the lower income is a kind of U shape that surrounds and separates the central area, which is high income, the periphery, which is high income, and then there's a kind of middle zone in the shape of a U that is lower income. So the problem that my friends, Alex Blagojevic, Cheryl Case, John Loring, and Annabelle Vaughn are looking at in Toronto is that the yellow areas, which at one point in time threatened to be abandoned, have become the area of highest income in the city, and to have relegated people of lower incomes into marginal areas and created a situation of peril for a great many of the people who live in Toronto. Now, in Waterloo Region, the situation is not like, it's not nearly as acute as in Toronto. You can see that in the traditional built up areas of the city, Waterloo, Kitchener, and Cambridge, the incomes are not high. They are not at the higher end. The higher incomes are in the perimeter of Waterloo, the south end of Kitchener, between Kitchener and Cambridge, and some of the east and west sides of Cambridge. But I fear that the yellow zones are going to go the way. It seems almost inevitable that the yellow zones in our municipalities are going to follow the course of the ones in Toronto as housing prices rise, as the supply of single family homes diminishes. I mean, clearly, if half of the new units that we're building in Waterloo Region are high density residential units, and we are limiting the expansion, we are limiting the sprawl, and we are in a perilous situation. And I think we as people who are interested in preserving the best aspects of our past and the best aspects of our cities, we have to work together to think about how we can meet all of the parameters, all of the criteria by which we would judge the quality of life and the quality of our cities, not just one. There's a lot of work going on now to look at the yellow zones and see if there's any way of increasing the density in those zones by small modifications, by gentle insertions, more or less gentle insertions. This is work by John Van Nostrand on the West Harbor area in Hamilton, where he's proposing a kind of investment strategy for individual property owners to introduce modest multiple dwellings on their properties, not changing the overall scale, not really changing the streetscape all that much. This is an attempt to bring the missing middle into the city without destroying the traditional fabric of the city. Now, I'm not judging these architecturally. That's not my purpose, but there are two projects very close to my house in Victoria Park, which attempt to establish a kind of middle ground, rather not high rises. The Barrel Lofts project, I mean, I think it's hilarious. This rendering leaves out the historic buildings on the side, on the far side of this condo. I mean, it's a 7-story condo. It's got some awkward aspects to it, but it does offer at least some hope of incorporating new buildings that in some way can be compatible, not destructive. I mean, they did tear down the original Barrack Castle to do this. I'm not, of course, competent to comment on that, but it was apparently in extremely bad repair. Otis here on David Street, just down the street from me, is completely out of character with the rest of Victoria Park. It's got nothing to do with the rest of Victoria Park. It's an interesting building. It's got terraces facing the park. It's relatively low scale. And I think I'm not necessarily advocating for these two projects, but advocating for a situation in which it becomes possible to insert new higher density, but not massive and high density projects. I mean, I have a huge fear of a kind of return to a bulldozer mentality, which would just spread high density all across the city. We need a variety of densities. We need a variety of types of buildings. We need to be careful about what we do, but we also need to be at least in some way capable of accepting change. Now, I noticed in the region's new plan for intensification, the original plans for intensification were mainly focused on the central axis of the ion and the areas around the ion stations. But in the new intensification plan, in order to meet their intensification goals, the region has laid out this series of new intensification corridors. These are the yellow, ironically, the yellow zones that extend intensification areas from the central axis of the municipalities along the ion, the southeast to northwest axis, and create these kind of transverse axes along Urb, Victoria, Ottawa, and Homer Watson. This is an interesting strategy. And of course is accompanied by the idea that at some point, these corridors may also carry LRTs. I don't find these frightening proposals. I actually think they have virtue. And largely because the urban landscapes in these areas are not highly developed and not of, generally speaking, of great historical or architectural significance. The experience with arterials, of course, is an interesting experience because, of course, in Toronto, the planning authorities have been for several decades trying to develop and then tweak a strategy for development along the arterial roads that protects the yellow zones, the residential zones behind the band of commercial and sometimes institutional, commercial and higher density buildings, not always higher density, as in this case along St. Clair Avenue. And they have preferred medium density developments, allowed densities to grow in order to try to attract development that does not disrupt the yellow zones. Now, this is a way of doing projects that if the region has its way and creates these intensification areas along the arterials, we're going to get into a situation at some point that is somewhat analogous to the one that's happened in Toronto. The problem with the arterial strategy in Toronto is it hasn't worked. There's so few projects that have actually been done following this project. Here, this is the vision, right? The previous slide was St. Clair Avenue as it exists today. This is the vision for St. Clair once these medium-rise buildings are built on the avenues. It creates instead of a 2- and 3-story street face, you have a 5- to 7-story street face with thriving shops on the ground floor and lots of pedestrians, et cetera, et cetera. How many of these things were actually done? Well, not very many. And of course, they're not really as, the character is quite different from what we saw in the last picture. This is one of the ones along St. Clair, and it's not 5 stories tall, it's 9 stories tall. They all have to have these stepped sections because of the sun angle regulations, so that especially if they're on the north side of the street, of course, they would block the sun for the houses in behind. So the building has to be sloped inwards at the upper stories. And of course, the problem with all this is that the lots along the arterials are limited, especially in their depth. So one of my graduate students, Matthew Barker, carried out an absolutely remarkable study of the city's regulations for these arterial buildings, the avenue. Here you see one on a corner between an avenue representing St. Clair and then a side street. And the problem is, frankly, that the lots aren't deep enough. And that given all of what you have to fit on the ground floor, and even more problematic on the upper floors, the depth of building required to get a double-loaded corridor in is sufficiently great that you can't actually do this. Like, they won't fit on the blocks. So what he did is looked to see what you would have to do to make it work. And the truth is, you have to encroach on the yellow zone. You have to start to encroach on the residential lots in behind the main street in order to get a footprint that actually works. And so it's no surprise that developers can't do what the city wants them to do, because it isn't doable. We have some similar situations along the Ion line. I'm thinking, and I will say here that we've had several thesis students look at this. This is a project by Sarah. And Sarah, if you're listening, why can I not remember your last name? You can put it in the chat. Sarah looked at the area between Kitchener and Waterloo, along King Street between Kitchener and Waterloo, where the Ion, one of the areas where the Ion is actually running in both directions on the same street. You know, the Grand River Hospital and KCI and this is one of the most obvious areas for intensification in the region. It's between the two cores. It's got very high employment. It's one of the densest employment areas with Grand River Hospital, with the insurance company. And it's got some pretty low density and highly modified residential areas on it. Sarah looked at it pretty carefully and considered the regulations and that one would apply to buildings to get medium rise residential and commercial buildings. Here you can see at the very bottom of the slide some high-rise residential buildings, but this could be an avenue development, and it could become a model for the development of the transverse avenues like Ottawa Street, like Victoria Street, that could create a pretty interesting and thriving urban community in Waterloo region. This is an avenue development that's actually already happened. Many of you will recognize King Street in Waterloo, north of University Avenue, where a street that was laid out in the post-war period with small, essentially single-family homes, mainly very small single-family homes. Those residential properties were bought up by developers. The developers put up buildings, multi-story residential buildings, creating a kind of canyon effect. And the reason I show this is to actually reinforce the main argument of Sarah's thesis, which was the buildings are in some way secondary. The most important thing we need to do in these areas is design the public spaces, design the streets, design the way cars move around, the way bicycles move around, and most importantly, the way people move around. And create a grade level, a public level, that actually dignifies the people who have to move around in it. I mean, this is atrocious. It's terrible. And who could have thought that this was a proper way to design a city? It's staggeringly bad. And as we intensify, the main message of the intensification strategy along avenues has to be to control the density, to control the height, and maybe in order to do that, we have to encroach somewhat on the so-called yellow zone. I mean, I understand in Waterloo, between between University Avenue and Columbia, between King Street and the University, that whole area is just essentially being chewed up. I know there is a plan that came in long after the horse had left the barn to make it inhabitable, but we cannot sit by, and this is not so much a heritage issue, this is a future-looking issue. We cannot sit by and accept the destruction of the network of public spaces, the destruction of the pedestrian experience. in the manner that we see in front of us here. So here's the hypocrisy of everything I'm saying. I live in this house. That's the view out my front door. The other morning, I know I'm blessed. I live in one of the most lovely situations in a North American city you could possibly imagine. And I guess my view is that I know not everyone can live in this house. A few people could, but not everyone. But we have to have some commitment to establishing a quality of public space, opportunities to gather, opportunities for recreation, opportunities to walk, accessible to the perhaps 10,000 more people who are going to be living in downtown Kitchener, the thousands who are going to be living in downtown Waterloo, and the thousands who are going to be living in the urban centers in Cambridge, Galt, Espeler, and Preston. The leaders of our city made a decision at the end of the 19th century to create an amenity like Victoria Park. I want to make a comment about preservation and built culture. I was going to do a little bit of a talk on the work of Alois Riegel, who wrote a monumental or a landmark essay in the 1920s called The Modern Cult of the Monument, in which he established a kind of set of values that he ascribed to monuments, why they were valuable, why the modern world appreciated them, and what was the systematic, he set up a system for analyzing the value we attribute to monuments. Since I managed to erase my speaking notes, I'm not going to go through all that, but it does actually point me to one comment I wanted to make about the built culture of Waterloo region. In his essay, Riegel is motivated actually to respond to a group of people in Europe, of thinkers in Europe in the early 20th century who decided that the past should be left to look after itself. That the value of a monument was its age, and solely its age. So no effort should be made to preserve it artificially. No effort should be made to specifically maintain it. It should give in to the processes of natural order, entropy and deterioration, and things should be allowed to go. Riegel accepted the intellectual integrity of this argument, but could not accept the implications of it, that anything from the past should simply be allowed to deteriorate moving forward. He spoke about another value, which was historic value, in which case he said clearly objects that have achieved some value, no matter how they achieved that value, from the past, that are valued for their historic merit, that have historic value, their value should be judged entirely on the basis of their authenticity. So we should preserve things as much as they originally were as possible, and make efforts to do that, make efforts to preserve, but only preserve those things that have complete authenticity, which is a pretty tough order too. He talked about commemorative value, and commemorative value, I mean, the most important thing is that it's eternal. If something is there to commemorate some historic event, then that thing itself is a monument that needs to last forever. He talked about use value, which is pretty straightforward. It's a pragmatic judgment on an object that exists to say whether it has use or not. And then he talked about newness value, that we ascribe to certain objects once they exist, a condition that they look, feel new. I mean, it's an interesting speculation. I mean, I'm always struck by the fact that people call the City Hall in Toronto the new City Hall, when it, of course, is approaching 70 years old, and it actually up close doesn't look that new, although it's been given a good going over. But it feels new. And you still see it used to represent the future, which is an extraordinary credit to the architect. Now, the reason I bring up these things, I bring up age value, historic value, commemorative value, newness value, and use value, is that I feel very strongly about the built culture of our region, that we are blessed with a pragmatic quality. We are blessed with a heritage of buildings, especially industrial buildings, that come down from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that fortunately have historic value. They represent a past that was extremely important in forming the foundation of our contemporary culture. They are sturdy, and they have a quality of genericism that makes them, that brings a tremendous amount of use value to them. And they also have a kind of newness value. I mean, I will always remember the first time I saw the Arrow Shirt Factory on Benton Street in Kitchener. I had no idea how old it was. No idea. It could have been built in the 1950s for all I knew, even the 60s. There is a kind of timeless quality to the industrial architecture. There's a sort of Doric quality, heaviness, ponderousness, regularity, geometric quality. These are things that are intrinsic to the architecture of our region, and I actually believe very strongly that we need to value them. And I think we do. I mean, here's the Seagram's Museum, the Button Factory, one of the first industrial conversions in Waterloo region, turning into a housing co-op. Of course, here are the Arrow Lofts. I'd prefer not to see the building going up beside it, but anyway, haven't got that choice. Of course, the Kaufman Lofts, the great Albert Kahn in Quadrangle, adding 2 stories of residential above in a I mean, I have to say, a very sympathetic and effective fashion. the Lang Tannery project, which of course is one, most, if Kitchener City Hall is the beginning of the redevelopment, the very beginning of the redevelopment of downtown Kitchener, I mean, the real catalyst for the transformation that we see on the commercial side and the employment side, et cetera, is the conversion of a factory into a center of high-tech exploration and commercial activity. And, a local favorite of mine anyway is the conversion of the Riverside Silk Mills into an educational facility, and one that I had a little bit to do with. Spectacularly successful projects, utilizing the existing buildings in extremely sympathetic ways and maintaining the spirit of the original buildings in every case, but giving them a use value that the original builders could never have ever have imagined. This is one of the most important heritage axes in our region. There is no question about it. It is one of the most important heritage axes in the region. And we should be proud of it. And we should make sure that it doesn't stop. Of course, the supply of 19th and early 20th century industrial buildings is going to stop. We are running out of them. But the record we collectively have in bringing these buildings into the 21st century, late 20th and 21st century is actually remarkable. And we need to be proud of it. As a corollary to that, I would just say, and I've made this argument elsewhere, I won't make it at length tonight, that the disposition of Waterloo region, Kitchener-Waterloo primarily, to a lesser degree Cambridge, the disposition to accept modern architecture in the period after the Second World War, I think is directly related to our industrial heritage and the fact that modern architecture derived from industrial architecture. The great proponents of the modern style in Europe that was imported into North America after the Second World War were themselves huge admirers of the architecture of the North American factory. They converted the architecture of the North American factory into an aesthetic that became modern architecture in Europe, which was then re-imported into North America. I'm only using one example here. I could go on all night about it, but the fact of the matter is, Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge built an extraordinary number of buildings of very high quality in the period after the Second World War. They basically rebuilt their cities. This is Barnett and Reeder's Kitchener Public Library. It was renovated by Levitt Goodman, the same architects who did the Children's Museum and the School of Architecture. Here, I just want to make the point that the building culture of our region really has its roots in industrial architecture. Those roots are re-expressed and re-flourish in the period after the Second World War. With the explosion of modern building, of educational buildings. I mean, one public high school in Kitchener-Waterloo in 1950, by 1970, there were 8. There are currently 9. 3 post-secondary educational institutions, hundreds of schools, banks, churches, public buildings. An astonishing number of buildings were built here. I'm working on the numbers, but it appears to me that we are substantially ahead in terms of sort of buildings per population of any other city in Canada in this period. So I'm in the realm of heritage. I simply want to say that the strongest traditions of heritage architecture in Waterloo region are industrial and post-war modern. And that may seem strange, but I'm, of course, as many of you know, a firm proponent of those two clusters of buildings as representing what built culture in this region is all about. This building actually looks pretty good up against the building beside it, a brand new building designed by Diamond Schmidt Architects. This building from 1958, the first office tower in Waterloo region. Less well known is it's the first office tower designed by the firm Webb and Menkes, which became Webb, Zarafa, Menkes, and Houston, and built office towers in virtually every city across Canada, many in the United States and many internationally. Building has stood up pretty well, and the present owners have made it into a thriving hub of high tech and modern, and I smile. I smile every time I look at it, and who would have known? Well, I won't spend long on this, but I'm working with a graduate student who is driven by the desire and the need to simply look at the real costs of destroying buildings. He was struck by the fact that the Ontario Heritage Act is relatively ineffective in preserving buildings. Of course, it's better than it was, but of course, it's still an imperfect instrument. The values that are enshrined in the Heritage Act, of course, are largely intangible. A building has design value. It's rare, unique, representative of a style or type, high degree of craftsmanship and artistic merit. These are judgments, demonstrates a high degree of scientific or technical achievement, historic value, contextual value. These are all judgments and are arguable, of course. They are provable, arguable, but they are they're judgmental. What Mr. Robinson decided to do was look at other criteria which might be brought to bear on the question of demolition. I mean, at the moment, the question of demolition arises because a property, it has value that is unrealized in the existing building. The existing building is deteriorating. The existing building no longer serves its original function. There are concrete reasons why people decide to demolish buildings. But what Andrew decided to do was look at durational criteria in terms of having survived as long as the building has survived. It has some intrinsic value, representative of material, construction method, and era, etc. Then he talks about material deconfiguration would cause a high energetic differential between material recovery rates and formation energy. The building must remain in its current configuration, as to do otherwise would not properly value the energy invested in the original. Now that's an interesting way of judging things. How much effort, how much energy, how much material, etc., went into the original building, and would demolishing it and replacing it with something else, in any way be an equivalency. You can actually measure the equivalency in this case. You may not be able to value it, but you can measure it. And then he talks about what he calls disembodied values. Disembodied in this case means what happens if you demolish it? Does it yield moderate use of salvaged material? Could materials be reused, refurbished, or recycled? Does it give you a high degree of salvage? Or if it's deemed structurally unsound and material entropy at the highest, materials must be reprocessed into new forms to be used again. What he's trying to do is look at buildings for exactly what they are. Right now, the only cost really is the cost of the property and then the cost of the demolition and the cost of disposing of the material. What Andrew's trying to find is go through an entire analysis that looks at all aspects of the materiality of the building, in addition to those aspects of judgment, cultural judgment, aesthetic judgment, historic judgment, etc. And then he does this extraordinary analysis of the life cycle of the building and how much embodied energy there is, the material in it, transportation. I'll tell you, when his thesis is published, it's going to be very interesting because he's actually writing a new act. Like he's putting the thesis in terms of legislation that would require all of these calculations so that it would become clear what we're destroying when we destroy a building. What are not only the values and judgmental qualities, assessments, but what are the numbers? What is the energy we're giving up? What is the material we're giving up? And I think I sometimes when I listen to him, I think, but man, this is just like, this is insane. No developer, like basically he's saying, if you take out this much material, you have to pay to bring new material in to replace it. You know, development charges would just go through the roof. And so they might, and perhaps they should, because of course, in a world of climate change and environmental crisis, there is some pretty fundamental thinking that suggests we should not take destruction lightly. I want to end by, on the most general level, and I'm a great fan of Ned Kaufman. This is the book he published in 2009 called Place, Race, and Story, Essays on the Past and Future of Historic Preservation. And of course, Ned believes that preservation has been too connected to architectural history and connoisseurship, that it's a kind of privileged and elite discourse that excludes the majority of the population and is in a certain way explicitly political. And that our assessments of urban neighborhoods have to take into account story, place, and race, not just issues of aesthetics and architectural value. It seemed to me when I first read it a kind of prophetic text, and now looking back on it after the events of this past summer and over the last few years, I really feel very strongly that Ned Kaufman is a prophet. So in the end, the heritage question mark is just, I think I don't have an answer to it. it's not a question. It is a question. It's an open question. At the School of Architecture today, we are being asked to consider every course we teach, design, technical courses, and cultural history courses from the point of view of cultural equity, racial equity, social equity. And it behooves us to look at our heritage and our history in a much different way than we have in past. I am an aging male. My ancestry is Canadian. My ancestors came to Canada in the early 18th century. My grandfather and my father designed hundreds and hundreds of buildings in Toronto and elsewhere in Canada. I went to high school in the 1960s and was educated with a history curriculum that started in grade 9 and 10 with ancient history and British history. It was explicitly imperialistic and colonial, although nobody said that. All I have to do is tell you, British history and ancient history, imperialistic and colonial. There would be those who are engaged in the critical discourse of today who would say, well, all of the architecture here is colonial. Only that which is explicitly indigenous is not colonial. There would be those who will point out that in the urban environment in Ontario today, a substantial proportion of the population was born in a country other than Canada and have mother tongues that are neither English nor French. Cities without memory are amnesic. I can't imagine that anyone wants a city without history. Cities without multiple dimensions, without multiple layers, that cities that don't speak to us of where we have come from. But I think it behooves us all to ask, and I use this as my icon, the Haldeman Tract, 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from source to mouth. To simply urge that we understand heritage is not absolute. Heritage has political dimensions. Heritage has racial dimensions. And I think we do ourselves no favors if we, in advocating, forget the dimensions of social justice, equity, and diversity. I want to say that I discussed with Susan earlier today that I would make a plug for the last element of the contribution I'm going to make to the ACO this year. And that is that we are working on a walking tour of the current development landscape in downtown Kitchener. We're going to produce a map that you take in hand or on your tablet or phone, start at King and Queen in Kitchener and do a big loop, and we're going to tell a story about what is actually happening on these construction sites and in transforming the urban landscape of downtown Kitchener. So we're working together on this. I'm working with a graduate student. The map should be ready in the next couple of weeks. I urge you to look for it when it comes out. We will advertise it and disseminate it. And although the weather promises to be a lot worse than it's been for the last 5 days, who could have thought? Who would imagine 22 degrees in November in beautiful Waterloo region? Anyway, I'm really anxious to make it an effective device for people to understand the scope and scale and profound influence that these changes are going to have, profound influence these changes are going to have on the future of our city.